on this computer. Governor Jeb Bush, thank you so much for joining us today for today's discussion.
Thank you, Bruce. Good being with you for sure.
I love your family. You and I have talked about this a lot. I wanted to start on a lighter note, just a story you had told me that seemed so surprising. I mean, I think your dad's one of the great presidents of all time. He's one of my favorite Americans. You know, war hero, successful politician. He prioritized character. He believed that the other side was the loyal opposition. He cut deals across the aisle. So many great things we all know about. But a story I had never heard before that you say he tells is he believes he invented the phrase "you demand," which is not something I think of when I think of 41. Would you start telling us how that came about?
Sure. This was post-presidency. He decided he was going to will his way into, Wikipedia, I guess. And if you go online and type in "you demand," you'll find that it's my dad actually achieved this incredible success of creating a fictitious story. It might actually, who knows, it might actually be true, but he claims in 1965, he was at a Houston Colt 45 baseball game, and Rusty, or maybe in the Astros first year, and Rusty Staub hits a home run, and he was on the third base line. And as Rusty's rounding third base, my dad stands up and yells, "You demand, Rusty." And that's how "You Demand" was created. And he told that story to enough people that it actually kind of became a fact. It's the ultimate form of fake news. It was fake news before fake news actually became, sadly, part of the nomenclature in American political life.
Well, I'm confident his place in history is very well cemented at the highest possible levels, whether or not ultimately Wikipedia and Urban Dictionary credit him with the phrase. He's part of our modern politics, and as you and I have talked a little bit about, we live in interesting political times. You know, as I take a look, there have now been 11 federal elections this century. So starting with 2000, and of the 11, 9 have seen change. Either the party controlling the House, the Senate, and or the White House has flipped. That is a really restless electorate. What do you take is going on? It's bigger than any one person. It's bigger than recent elections. What do you see is going on that's driving, both in the United States and frankly around the world, populists rising up and voters just flip-flopping back and forth trying to find something?
I think there's just a growing dissatisfaction with how government is working. It's not solving the problems that it used to solve. Part of it is this hyper-partisan kind of environment we're in, where you're successful by pushing someone down. You're not successful by achieving a desired, positive result. It's basically tearing the heart out of your opponent, who's the enemy. That's how you measure your success. And so it's hard to imagine how, in that kind of environment, how you could fix some things. But there's some things that are broken. And I think the electorate is dissatisfied with how things are working. I mean, I focus a lot, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, in the K-12 system across our country. But if you look at job training, you could walk into a job training facility, an office somewhere in any place in the United States, and it would not look anything different than it did in 1970. The only difference is we spent a lot more money on it, but it's training people for jobs that don't exist, sadly, in many cases. We have a skills gap in this country that is huge. And so you would think that wouldn't be necessarily a big big political deal to say, let's transform how we train people to upskill them so that they can earn success. But no, in fact, that people are holding on for dear life for systems of training that may have worked in 1970. When Senator Hartke was a United States senator. It doesn't work now. And across the spectrum, healthcare, across the spectrum of policy, things aren't working. And I think that explains, partially at least, why people are deeply dissatisfied. And then on top of it, you have now you have a set of people have their own set of facts, which is really dangerous, I think. You have alternative set of facts. That's a term that I remember coming up recently. It's just like, what? I mean, some of this stuff is just nuts, but it's dangerous. And now you see the effects of it. I have people. I was with a congressman Sunday. They were down here for the NRCC or something. I think it was the NRCC. And the guy was telling me that he goes to town hall meetings now, totally, people are saying the craziest stuff that they passionately believe. And these are normal, these are good people. These aren't people that are, deranged or anything. They just have now convinced themselves using a set of facts that aren't the truth, that, there's a conspiracy or there's QAnon, all this stuff is going on, and it's quite dangerous. And it exists on the left and the right. It's not just, the focus is on the right, of course, but there's some pretty crazy conspiracies on the left as well.
So, so you just opened three awesome cans of interesting worms, and you've long been known as one of the real policy thinkers in Republican circles and the NGA in your day. Let's look at each one of those. Let's start with the retraining, because you're right. So much of both retraining and education, it's still on an agrarian timetable in an industrial setting. I take a look at colleges, which seem to cost, 3-4 times what they cost when I went. And while some of the buildings are newer and the gyms are truly phenomenal, how they teach, what they teach hasn't really changed. What if we give you the opportunity to really go in and do radical reconstruction on K-12 and also on worker retraining, how do you fix them?
Well, I would say you start with the premise that they're not two different silos. It's the same thing. Learning ought to be lifelong. And you ought to, the building blocks are, to begin with, children need to learn how to read. And by the end of third grade, if they haven't mastered reading, it's hard to imagine how they're going to do math and science in fourth grade when they start reading to learn. And so there ought to be a real focus on early childhood literacy, and not allow these gaps to grow exponentially, because they sadly start really early. And then the other thing I'd say is that the aspiration ought to be for high school that students graduate college and or career ready, not college ready necessarily, because college is not as relevant as it might have been historically. It's still important, don't get me wrong, but there's also the chance to embed in the high school experience credentialing to allow a person to be motivated to be able to start a career. Not every person needs to go to college. So that'd be the second thing I would advocate. The third thing would be that college ought to focus on the students. If you measure a graduation rate based on 4-year degrees, you measure it in percentage of kids that graduate in 6 years, there's something wrong. A 4-year degree should be completed in 4 years, not 6 years. And 60% of all students graduate, full-time students graduate with a 4-year degree in 6 years. That should be fixed. The cost of that on the backs of, recourse debt on the backs of students is outrageous for a great country like ours. So I would say that should be another element of this, is that we should reform our university system and community colleges to assure that kids are getting relevant degrees at the lowest possible cost so that they could begin to pursue their dreams. And then finally, we should open up the system of upskilling and reskilling to the whole new array of providers that exist. And there's the world is awash of brilliant young people, particularly reinventing the wheel, if you will, and trying to figure out how to partner with institutions that we relied on in the past that aren't working, so that we can deal with this, 6 million people that don't have skills to be able to get a job. That's a moonshot. That's something, and it's doable. It's fixable. So I would say that this should be lifelong. And, the problem is that there are a lot of economic interest at stake when the more radical your views are on how to go about this, more transformative your views are, the more people feel threatened, and they hold on for dear life for systems that worked quite well in the mid-20th century that aren't working right now.
If you go back more than mid-20th, if you go back to the early 20th century, what you find was, starting in the Northeast and then going to the Midwest and then the rest of the country, a movement that said we ought to pay for 4 more years of schooling to teach children, paid for by taxpayers, so free, the skills needed to compete in the new industrial era. That was the high school movement. Before then, most American kids stopped in 8th grade. Suddenly you had a standardized and relevant criterion that became a nationwide, now everybody takes for granted, even though people attacked the proponents at the time for socialism or whatever. There are some, President Biden and others, who suggest, why don't we make 2 years of community college, grades 13 and 14, paid for by taxpayers, basically the high school movement play, which did give America the greatest workforce in the 20th century. How do we rerun the same play for the 21st? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, free this, free that. It's not free. That's my first thought. And of course, the president is also proposing waiving some of the debt obligations. So on the backs of people trying to get a higher education, we're allowing universities, particularly, not so much community colleges, the cost of education has gone up exponentially. The number of administrators has gone up. You mentioned the sports arenas and buildings, all that stuff has grown, but the number of students graduating has not grown at all. So if it's free with big time reforms attached to it, it should be considered. But I think it's important for everybody to have skin in the game, to be honest with you. Look, if 25% of all high school juniors are capable of taking college level work and only 4% do, maybe what we ought to do is to start allowing high school kids that are capable of excelling to do so. Now, that makes it, if you're a student, full-time student, it's, you're spending 6 years in the university makes money off of that. They don't make money off of someone who starts as a sophomore in college. This system is designed for the suppliers of education, not for the students and not for the parents. And I think the first thing, if you really wanted to accelerate these changes, then it ought to be based on what the student needs, not in what the parents deserve in terms of cost and in terms of their desires for their kids. So parental choice for K-12 is a huge catalyst for reform, I think. And in the college level, there should be pay for performance. Many states are now moving in this direction, which is exciting. I mean, Florida is an example of this. Indiana's done the same thing. So you have real world criteria. There's a pool of money that the universities compete for based on how they do on that criteria. And the most important one is, can you get your kids to graduate, your students to graduate, if they're full-time students, in 4 years? And then, you go to the next step, which be, are these degrees of relevance? Psychology is the #1 degree program in our universities. And I mean, I know we need a lot of therapy in America today. We're all, mentally strung out, I guess. But I think we need more engineers, probably. We need people that, I mean, if you get a psych major, you're likely probably going to graduate school where the student loans actually, the cost grows even more. So the mindset needs to change. And I think taking power away from the suppliers of education and moving to the consumers of it would be really helpful.
I was always wondering, as a leader, you created excellence in education. Why'd you pick education? When you left the governor's office, was it based upon your experiences as the governor at the NGA, your perception of where America needed to go? But you put about 20 years now into, really making this a personal passion, at least to my observation, more than any other issue or lane. What was the motivation?
Well, it was, I'm motivated, I was motivated for a love of learning by my mother. So it started pretty early. I was Secretary of Commerce in the state of Florida. And if you travel the state, which I did, I went to every county. Every time you ask the question, what's the most important issue in this community for job creation? It's the quality of education. And it's been that way forever. Florida's education system, K-12 particularly, was really near the bottom. And I got to take, I advocated as a candidate. I went to visit 300 schools as a candidate for office in 1997 and 98. And I learned to put a human context around this because, if you sit in the computer lab where a guy is practicing for the high school comprehensive test, an 8th grade level test back in 1998 to graduate. That was the only thing remaining. Basically breathing 180 days and then passing this 8th grade level test. And he couldn't answer the following question. A baseball game starts at 3 o'clock and ends at 4:30. How long's the game? Now, the wise asses out there probably say 9 innings, but the answer is an hour and 30 minutes. If you can't answer that question, how do you expect to be able to live a purposeful life? And that's these low expectations. It kind of drove me to say we need to do a lot of things, and we need to do it at a faster pace. And so in my post, and we got great results, to be honest with you, thankfully, because there was a lot of opposition to the suite of reforms we offered up. And since then, we've been helpful. We tried in our foundation to try to help governors that want to move the needle on rising student achievement, using part of the Florida story, but there's other great examples. The state that's had the greatest gains in the NAEP test, the Nation's Report Card, in the last 2 cycles, Mississippi. And they've embraced ending social promotion. They've focused on early childhood literacy. They've expanded parental choice. They grade schools A through F, similar to what Florida and other states have done. They have high expectations for every child. They've stuck with it under 2 governors. And so the needle can be moved. It's sad that we see the student achievement lagging, because it's pretty clear what happens when you're a 9th grade level reader or a 9th grade level math taker, and you graduate from high school. It's pretty clear what's going to happen to you going forward. And that's accelerating as we move in this period of incredible disruption to our economy. The skills required are significantly higher. And people should be marching in the streets about this. This is the great equity issue of our time, and no one does. It's really frustrating.
Well, there is plenty of marching in the street. However, perhaps this isn't this should be, but isn't necessarily the motivating topic. You in the beginning there, you'd mentioned in terms of why people are dissatisfied with where things stand. You started with education, you moved to healthcare, and I got to tell you, I'm kind of torn, because on the one hand, obviously we spend more and it's really inequitable. On the other hand, man, I love my healthcare. I love that America crushed the world in terms of the best vaccines coming up fastest. Our hospitals are awesome. If I need something, I don't have to wait very long, as opposed to if I were British. It feels like we've kind of got the best of healthcare systems, and then if you look at dollar per life expectancy, the worst. I'm interested, given your vantage point, what you see the reform path for healthcare.
Well, I'll tell you. I'll give you. I went to my ophthalmologist, which I hadn't seen in 7 years, which at my age, that's probably not smart, and my dermatologist today. So two doctors' visits in 24 hours. First class. They got the coolest equipment. I'm asking all these, I'm a nerd about this stuff. I love it. The explosion of technology into the doctor's office is just amazing. You're totally right. We have the best healthcare system in the world. And then I leave and I pull out my credit card to pay, and they said, no, you're good, because I'm on Medicare. I don't know what the price is. I don't know. There's no, I'm not a consumer in the sense that I'm an informed consumer, for sure. I got great care because I'm on Medicare, and these are first-class physicians, but there's something wrong with that. So that would be the first thing, is that we need to empower people to be making informed choices about their healthcare, including what the cost is. But since it's Medicare, it's my grandchildren. When you pile in we have a $50 trillion unfunded liability when you add Obamacare, the pharmacy benefit, Medicare, and Medicaid and Social Security. $50 trillion net present value of costs. I'll be dead, but I worry about my 5 grandchildren. No one's lifting a finger to try to reform that system by extracting these extraneous costs that are way over the top, more than any other country in the world. The second thing I think is somehow we need to move to a system that prevents illness rather than reacts to it. That's harder to do, but that's something that I think there's a movement in that regard. Not so much through government, but corporations are providing these benefits to workers, and there's other ways that people now are improving their lifestyles, their diets, their exercise. Not everybody in our country certainly is in that category, but those that are going to end up living better lives at a lower cost for society. So What a mess. I mean, we've not even come close to reforming this. And, my party, it's just almost embarrassing to see the plans that never came to counteract this, big government overreach in my mind about how healthcare should be reimbursed and how, the system should exist. We didn't offer a compelling alternative. And the net result is that we just have more costs. It's still fantastic for sure. I totally agree with you in terms of the quality, but it's dysfunctional beyond belief.
Well, dysfunctional beyond belief sounds like a good segue, because you mentioned your party, which is my party too. It's not really your father's Republican Party. I mean that literally and figuratively. To see Mitt Romney getting booed in Utah, to see Liz Cheney, standing up for a statement of fact and principle and defense of democracy and peaceful transfer of power, which I always figured was like the core great element of American democracy. And, we'll see what happens over the next 2 weeks, but the media is hyping up the idea that she may get run out. What do you feel like has gotten into the GOP, and is it terminal or curable?
Sure hope it's curable. I can't imagine that the Republican Party or the conservative side we're a center-right country. If you forget DC for a moment, which I try to do on a regular basis. We have 30 Republican governors, 29, 30. We have control over almost, I think 60% of statewide elected officials are Republican. We have significantly more control over state legislatures than the Democrats do. That's more of a reflection of the fact that we're a center-right country than the morass in DC. But having said that, this is not a conservative party when you abandon fiscal responsibility, and it's certainly not the Reform Party. We're not advocating meaningful reforms, which I think is the path forward. The path forward is to say we have all of these disparate groups that generally share their concern of this muscular federal government with massive amounts of spending and hyper regulation. Generally, people oppose that in all these different hyphenated forms of conservatism. But what we need to do, I think, is to have an agenda that forges together these varying populist, sentiments, the working class folks that feel disenfranchised, small business people that see the challenge of existing right now. If you talk to any small business in America today, their number one issue is they can't find people to work. The reason why they can't find people to work is non-work is actually economically more feasible for many people than work right now. Now that's going to subside over time, but the stimulus has actually stalled out economic activity. And yet we're not offering the kind of alternatives as it relates to strengthening families, creating an environment where there's rising income. The job training issue is a great example of this. This is where we should forge a more positive, hopeful agenda than just being against the bad guys on the other side. We're never going to win if we're angry all the time. There has to be some degree of hope here, I hope. I mean, this idea that it's just end is near, follow me. That's not a sustainable political message, historically, at least. I think we're in a period of an aberration right now.
So I hope you're right that we can rally around a hopeful and inclusive leader. It does not feel like that is something I'm going to, when we're done with this Zoom, find on Twitter. But many, Marco.
Twitter is not don't be, I'm gonna let you in on a dirty little secret. Twitter is not an indication of what normal people think.
Great point. Twitter is not America, for sure. Senator Rubio and others, there are some who feel like the future of the GOP needs to be more, a phrase you used a moment ago, of the voice of the working class. And for many in big business, there's a perception on questions like trade, on questions like immigration, on questions such as foreign policy. The Washington consensus of the late 90s and the early aughts was, the GOP at least, was very much globalist. We were in favor of immigration reform. President, your brother, President Bush, had a meaningful effort, although it died on the guns. But um, do you think that that's a choice that needs to be made, that the future is indeed a blue collar, and it can be blue collar, it doesn't have to just be white blue collar, it should be blue collar of all races? Is that a viable lane for the GOP?
I think it has to be part of a coalition to get to winning presidential elections, for sure. And there's a cultural component here as well that's important. All of this wokeness of large corporations declaring without a whole lot of thought, it seems to me, that Major League Baseball shouldn't have the All-Star game in Atlanta. I mean, on the face of it, the Georgia election law was more progressive, in quotes, than the New Jersey law that was hailed as a great example of changes, hailed by the Biden administration and by Governor Murphy. And this jumping into these issues, whether it's large institutions or just the changing culture, I think puts Democrats in a very vulnerable position, because most people just don't want to have, they don't want their sports to be contaminated by politics. They don't want large corporations dictating to them how they're supposed to behave. They don't want all that. And so if we're on the side of working people and small businesses, and I would add that we shouldn't have an industrial policy where we pick winners and losers. Sometimes my Republican friends get the tendency is to join Democrats in that. I don't think we need to do that. I think Americans with a fair playing field will do quite well without having left-handed Albanian tax credits and all the stuff that people seem to think are really meaningful. So there's a coalition here that could be built. What I would add, though, is, and it should be done in a positive way. There's nothing wrong about advocating traditional values. You're not disparaging someone who may have a differing view. It's okay to advance the things that have created the greatness of our country. It's okay to be a patriot, to love our country with our heart and soul. And it's okay to be on the side of people that are struggling right now, to make sure that they have the tools to be successful. And it's okay to be for traditional family life. I mean, all this stuff, the danger is that we're fearful of offending to the point, or we're accused of offending, that we kind of lose part of a winning message. It's not as much of a big a deal as in outside of DC, but in DC, it's pretty, right now it's really hard to have a thoughtful voice.
Well, look, you're right. I mean, by the way, you've now lost the left-handed Albanian vote and the broccoli vote. So if you run again, there's some critical constituencies. I do think
I do support the right-handed Croatian tax credit.
I do think the winning, ultimately, though, it seems to me that the winning path is to recognize, on the one hand, traditional values, but on the other hand, how do you ensure that's inclusive, as opposed to traditional values doesn't include? And I think there are alternative family types, for example, and the trick is they can be traditional, and we want them on our side, and we want to embrace them. And too often it feels like folks try to identify who they are by who they're against.
Totally agree, completely agree. But to ignore those values that are important, they're part of the stability of our society, I think, it's bad politically for us. So you've hit on the challenge, which is to be inclusive, to be hopeful and optimistic, not always constantly banging the other side for being evil, and to offer up something that gives people hope that there's a better chance for their children than what they have. I still think that, I don't think we're doomed as a country. I actually think, look, I don't know what you think about this, but I'm 68. I'd rather be 21. What's your view on that?
I'd love to be your roommate right now, though we wouldn't be going to class. We'd be wearing masks. I got a 21-year-old. He definitely would not rather be 68. I know that. But
we're on the verge of the greatest time to be alive.
I agree with that.
And there's so many positive things going on, but we're moping around as a country, and we're dividing ourselves up in all these disparate parts rather than lifting up our head and seeing what the potential could be if we fix a few big, complicated things. And I think that ought to be I want that to be the conservative side winning those arguments rather than bemoaning how bad the left is.
So I share that worldview for sure. I work with and talk to a lot of the CEOs, most of whom want to try to run business in a globally competitive environment and don't want to be politicians. What they might push back, and I think they're right about some of this, and they'd say, we don't want to weigh in on election laws, but these are laws that were created to respond to a stop the steal fantasy. And so rather than being a what's the right a way to make sure voters are all included, this is a we want to satisfy the Trump base when they're lying about this. In the same way, if you think about some of these bathroom laws, totally unnecessary in North Carolina and in Texas. And for the CEOs who have very diverse employee populations, they say, look, we didn't want to be debating this stuff, but suddenly a law hostile to my workforce is showing up. We're going to show up. So some of the CEOs might say they're reluctant rather than eager combatants in some of these cultural fights, but they feel like, or climate, they feel like nobody's doing anything, so we got to step up.
Yeah, so it's an interesting challenge. The Georgia law is Georgia turnout. There was no voter suppression.
Right.
Georgia turnout was better than many states that claim, that they don't have voter suppression. The law changes were on the margin. Some of which had to happen because, you're operating an election with an emergency. At some point, Governor Kemp is going to waive the emergency rules, just as Governor DeSantis did yesterday. And so the previous laws will be the ones that you operate in. So they made adjustments there. The policy itself wasn't the problem. The problem was what you just described, which was it was a response to placate a group of people who thought the election was stolen. And that was wrong. The environment in which this was operating, and it's the reason why, by the way, Mitch McConnell's not majority leader. It's this bizarre belief that the election was stolen, perpetuated by a sitting president of the United States, created an incredibly toxic environment that people rejected. So I totally get that. I just think corporation CEOs need to be really careful because they also have employees that don't share the views of a diverse workforce necessarily. They're part of that diverse workforce, and their views need to be heard as well. And so, man, it is a quagmire to get involved in this stuff. And then you have the hypocrisy. So, if you're an airline, then you want to serve the fastest growing market with a incredibly growing middle class. You want to serve it from the United States to that country. And you don't stand up and say anything about genocide or, re-education camps for more than 1 million people. You're silent there, but you say that the All-Star game can't be played in Atlanta. You're opening yourself up to a big, big mess. And so, I don't know. I think it's better, not to go ready, fire, aim. Better to think this stuff through.
Well, no, that's totally true. And in giving advice, one of the keys for business leaders is to the point you made a moment ago, to don't see this as a social media problem. That has you thinking fast. This should require thinking slow. You need a very diverse team to weigh all of these questions and think about, well, what's the precedent? Are we hypocritical? And the advice that we give, frankly, the best thing you can do if you want to weigh in on voting rights, question one, do you give your own employees paid time off to vote?
Exactly.
And if you don't, maybe you could do that, because that's walking your talk. You made the point also about, about the presidency. And it does remind me, one of the greatest things your dad ever did, that letter he left to Bill Clinton on the Resolute desk in the Oval, that is the great tradition of America, is switches parties, but you wish your successor with all sincerity, who beat you in an ugly presidential campaign without a majority, by the way, a plurality, but you wish him success and you mean it. And everything you do following your presidency is supportive of his doing the hardest job in the world.
Exactly. And you become friends. I can guarantee you that Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush weren't buddies in 1992. But over time, they became very close friends. And President Clinton, in my dad's last years, treated him so respectfully so wonderfully. It made me change my views about Bill Clinton, to be honest with you. I wasn't a big fan of his. And I just saw the affection that my dad had for him, and it was mutual. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's kind of what we need to get back to in some regards. We'll see. We'll see if it happens. I do think this is an aberration. I think we're, and I don't know how this, you've studied this stuff far more than I do. I think we're at the end of a cultural era. The baby boomers, my generation, our culture was basically created in the late 60s and the early 70s. It's the counterculture that became the dominant culture. And it isn't very good, to be honest with you. I'm not very proud of my generation's contribution to American cultural life, but it's run out of gas. And there's something being built right now, yet to be completely defined. And that cultural change, I think, will have a bigger impact on politics than anything else. Politics is not a leading indicator of who we are. It lags. It is our culture that actually dominates. So if we're more vulgar, if we're less caring, if we yell more on Twitter or whatever, we shouldn't be surprised our politicians aren't mirroring that, right? And so if I could go 5 years maybe into the future and peek back, I could give you answers to where our politics will be, because there is a change. We had the Second Great Awakening in the 19th century that created the abolitionist movement, the prohibition movement, the women's suffrage movement. All of that was created basically by an evangelical movement to kind of restore, back to the term, traditional values in American life that was changed because of this disruption of people men mostly moving west. And we've had other cultural changes that have taken place for the good for the country, is sure. I think the 60s big change had some really huge benefits for sure, but it also had a self-centeredness that I think hopefully will subside.
Well, and I like too, it's in your point there, traditional values, yet expanding the franchise to women, which isn't a traditional way of life, but the core value is the American value of greater inclusion in politics. And it feels to me that so much of what we've got to do now is to recognize the difference between core values and cultural team you feel like you're playing for. You said, and I don't disagree, you wish you were 21 right now. And I do think it's the greatest time in history to be alive. What would you do if Jeb Bush is 21 years old, raring to go? You're just out of school. How would you start your life? What path would you go on?
I'll tell you what I did when I was 21. I'd graduated I got married, and I graduated from the University of Texas in 2 years. And 2 years later, I was opening up a representative office for a Texas bank in Caracas, Venezuela. I was 10 years younger than the second youngest bank rep of like 80 of them. I would take risks. I would embrace the unforeseen and the unknown, just as I had, the blessing to do when I was that age. But I think now the unknown and unforeseen has just, amazing possibilities at speeds that, when I was 21, we could have never comprehended. So the advice I give to 21 people that age is basically, don't try to plan it out. Go for it, man. I mean, get in there, take risks. Your life will change. It's never one step forward, all planned out. That's not how life works. It's 10 steps forward, 3 steps back, 5 steps forward, 10 steps back. And you learn every time you have adversity, and you overcome it and you move forward. And I just think in the environment that we're in now, where there's so many possibilities of cures of disease, 10 years ago, could you have imagined autonomous vehicles and the potential for increased productivity? Or, can you imagine 5G technologies allowing the equity issues in our country to be diminished somewhat, because everybody has access to a job because they have high-speed broadband to their home. They have access to high-quality healthcare because they have broadband access to the home, and they can get a higher quality education. All this stuff is now, we're literally at the precipice of this extraordinary time. if we don't screw it up.
Well, I'm personally hoping for flying cars, which keep getting promised, but
People are investing in those things now.
it's crazy. So I have I only two more questions here, and I do appreciate your thoughts. And by the way, for those who are regulars at these conversations, your answer on what you do if you were 21 is almost identical to that given by Ursula Burns, the former CEO of Xerox, great friend. And her comment, what she says to the young folks is, or I asked her, what would you do different? She'd say, I'd be more aggressive. I'd take more risks. I try to go faster, which is fascinating to me because you guys have certainly had different growing up backgrounds.
She's a good friend, and she's a brilliant person.
Force of nature, one of my favorite people I ever got to work with. So last two questions. First, hypothetically, you get a call from the president, Joe Biden. He wants your advice. He's not looking to get press on it. You're not looking to get press on it. What advice would you give the president and you're a patriot. I would always give any president of any party my honest advice, and I know you would too. What do you recommend that he do?
I would recommend that he fulfill the mandate of his election, which is to restore, which he's doing on one level. The restoration of civility is important. And I think he's doing, he's a calming influence, which I admire in this time of great tumult. It's nice to have a president that's not on fire every day. Hair's not on fire. But what I think he's missed is, I think his election wasn't to fulfill a 21st century version of FDR, which is kind of seems like that's the path that they're on. It was to build coalitions again across the aisle. It was to find common ground that exists and work on it. Look, if you think about this, and you're much more knowledgeable about this than I am, but there are probably 25 senators that if the president decided that he would lead them, there would be a breakthrough. It'd be a breakthrough on job training for sure. There'd be a breakthrough on, certainly possibly even on immigration, where you focus on border security first and then transform our immigration system so it's a catalyst for everybody to win. Infrastructure would be another place. There's 5 or 6 things that with President Biden, resorting back to the old Joe when he was in the Senate, where that was his natural instinct. If he did that as president, there would be the center would hold. It could be rebuilt. And I think that would be a more important legacy for him than if he's successful in getting these massive spending bills that are just, there's never been anything like it. And to me, it's really dangerous because I don't know what the outcome is. I'm surprised we haven't already had a calamity with our monetary policy. I was wrong. I mean, I thought quantitative easing, no textbook said it was a brilliant idea, and yet it has created a wealth effect that is dangerous. And there's a lot of wealthy people that haven't really earned it because the Federal Reserve's been their secret partner. But when you combine monetary policy to the extent that it exists with 0% interest rates with a fiscal policy that is extraordinary, I don't know what the outcome of that's going to be. And so the search for legacy, if that's his motivation, I think my advice to him would be start reweaving the web of civility, which he's done, I think, but also move back to a consensus-oriented governance model. I don't think 2022 is going to be a great year for Democrats because of the overreach, but in the interim, these changes could be permanent, and I don't think they're great for our country. So that would be my advice. I'm not sure he would take it, and he's not asking. So, I wish I do. I'll tell you what, though, when he got elected, I congratulated him on Twitter the day after, and I said on Twitter, which is not normally where I say these things, that I'm going to pray for him every day, and I have, just as I prayed for President Trump. And I think we all need to do that. Back to the idea of how President Clinton behaved with my brother and how my dad behaved with President Clinton. We should respect our leaders and pray for their, sound judgment for sure, because we need them to be sound in their judgment.
Well, amen. I normally would close by asking, as I always do, folks, for a reason for optimism that's not the vaccine, but you've given several here in the last 5 and 10 minutes. You've been gracious with your time, Governor. We really appreciate it. It's always fascinating to get to hear from you in a civil, thoughtful environment, and you haven't disappointed. So thank you for making the time.
Thanks, Bruce. I want to meet the person in your incredible firm that does the PowerPoint presentations. World leading PowerPoints. I love them.
I'm glad I haven't stopped the recording. All right. Thank you, sir. Good to see you.
Take care.